and we'll begin our time together with karakia. So, me noi tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki. So thank you all for coming to join us today for this presentation by Dr. Andi Salamon from Charles Sturt University in Australia. We're really delighted to have Andi with us today to build on some research and ideas that she shared in a previous online seminar, which was in May just last year, 2022. So this seminar is being recorded, and the recording is going to be available in a few days on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. And there will also be time at the end of Andi's presentation for any questions that you might have for her. Maria will facilitate those. So I will now pass over to Dr. Maria Cooper to welcome and introduce Dr. Andi Salamon.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. So I just said to Andi, you've written a really nice bio of yourself that captures everything that kind of Andi stands for. So I said, I'm just going to read what you wrote. So Dr. Andi Salamon is an early childhood teacher, lecturer and researcher with 20 years of, or more than 20 years of professional early childhood education experience. She graduated with her doctorate in 2016 and teaches education studies at Charles Sturt University based in Bathurst, Australia. Her research expertise, experiences as a practitioner and leadership role as a director in ECE contexts come together in her work, and she values making her research accessible to educators working with infants in ECE settings. An advocate of infants' rights and quality early years experience and pedagogy for all children, Andi brings her passion to uphold children's optimal learning to her work with pre-service teachers. And I just want to add that everything she has written there I can speak for in terms of what I know of Andi's research. I've been researching, writing with Andi and a few others, and your passion for the youngest people who are in our community comes through really strongly, and that the idea of making everything that we do in a place like this matter and count for practice. So thank you for your advocacy work there. I'm pleased to be working with you and for you to be sharing with us in Aotearoa. So yeah, over to you, Andi.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, Justine. Although I say thank you again later. Thank you all. In that introduction, Andi does not turn her phone off, but she should, and now she has. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm Andi Salamon. I'm here from Australia. I work at Charles Sturt University, and in Australia it is customary to acknowledge the Indigenous lands we are on. But I know I'm not in Kansas anymore, so I've had a little look. Come on in. At what is customary to do here in Aotearoa, which I think is right. It was a funny video with a policeman who said, "Have a go." So the first being to use Māori words first and follow on with English words. I have also now learned the vowel sounds for Māori words and won't try to introduce myself. But I will say, kia ora, everyone. So glad to have made it here today, finally. I am very grateful to be here in Tamaki Makaurau. There it is, in Auckland. Thank you all for having me here, and again to Maria and Justine especially, who I'm really grateful to be finally meeting in person. I'm sorry. I've said purpose so much today. As per our Australian custom, I would like to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charles Sturt University campuses are located. Those lands have always been places of learning and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour them for maintaining the cultural and intellectual foundations that ensure those traditions continue in perpetuity. I would also like to acknowledge my efforts these last 4 years at CSU and speak the words of the Wiradjuri people, where my campus in Bathurst is located, and the CSU ethos of India Mara Wenangana, which is the aim for us all to learn the wisdom of respectfully living well in a world worth living in. And if we go back before that, I have been doing what an Indigenous elder and colleague I worked with at my first university job taught me to do, and that's think about acknowledgement of country as storying. And that's where we acknowledge the story of the people whose lands we are on, and share our own story as part of an ongoing story we tell together. And this year, for the first time, I have found the scholarly work on which that thinking is based. And, oh no, that's the scholarly work. Oh, see what happens when I go off script? I will just read my notes. And so you can see here that that thinking is conceived of as this shared reflective practice. And I think it's really important, especially in infant toddler pedagogy, that we engage in reflection about our own ways of being. And the one thing, and as the authors say, the one thing that all Australians or people in Australia have in common is that they walk on Aboriginal countries every day. In this chapter that's reflective of Australian Indigenous knowings, the authors story the power of reflective practice. And reflection they consider as an ancient wisdom inherent in Indigenous knowings. Our reflective practice embraces our connections with the world and our ability to live as part of the world rather as distinct from it. They go on to talk about their world and worldview, which privileges Indigenous knowings, and share their story and experiences as they engage with pre-service teachers in Australia. And I feel so lucky and grateful to be moving into that space of acknowledging that storying. And so it is always right for me to start with part of my own story and worldview. As a brownish Brooklyn-born Jewish woman with Ukrainian parents, I have reflected on and located my worldview that started as a culturally different child growing up in a mostly white Australia. I've come to see I have a unique understanding of respect and responsibility that were instilled in me at a young age through my cultural heritage, and to look at me, you wouldn't imagine, but religious schooling. And so I continue into my adult life with a deep respect. That continues as a deep respect for the new places I go and people I encounter there. As a pre-service teacher, I grew up with inspiring teachers myself, and learning about the pedagogical project of Reggio Emilia, my grounding of respect extended to a professional arena, and this idea of reciprocity that kind of was added, where along with a professional responsibility, I could see that a part of my work, my purpose, was to uphold the rights of all children in the work I do in early childhood education. And then slowly, as I kind of started with preschoolers, I went backwards and ended up with working with infants. This year, I have come to see in many ways how these parts of my story, along with others, contribute to my image of the child, and in particular of the infant child, who I see as capable and competent. And as Loris Malaguzzi famously said, that image of the child, for me, the infant child, shaped by my story, is where my teaching began. And I think you will see it has shaped my research as well. So that's where I say my life is a bit of a vortex, because sometimes where I start is where I end up, but then at a different point in time. And it comes out in different ways. And then one of the things I'm really grateful for is I then kind of feed that back into my teaching with teachers. My son says, I teach teachers to teach, and it's the best job description, I think. It puts it very clearly. And so, as the title suggests, there are two parts of my presentation today. The first is about the original body of work, and that relates to a project with infants that had original aims, methods and outcomes, both intended and unintended. And the second part of the presentation is the story about what happened when I went back to the site. And that was almost 3 years later. And I shared the research with many of the same children. And that's resulted in a new unintended outcome, which was firstly the fabulousness of seeing these babies again, who as a researcher with babies, you see videos and photos, even as a teacher, you spend time with them when they're babies, and you spend so much time they stay as babies, but in real life they grow up. And so coming back after all this time was just such a treat, having been deep in the data about and of them. And then another unintended outcome is the beginning of fulfilling. So I kind of proposed from this project that I did start in 2020 that there were certain implications. There was a so what, and I got to do that with the actual children, which was a real treat as well. And so I've taken the playful part out, so you see it in brackets, and I'm going to focus on the participatory part. I came to see that, as Justine said, I did present some of that about the play-based kind of direction that the research took in the last time, in May last year, so you can always access that. But for today, I'm focusing on the participatory part, which is where it started, and really that's where it is coming to end, which I think is pretty cool and a bit unique. And I also have to say that I've pieced the first half of the presentation together from a range of different presentations, which kind of makes it a bit of a tapestry of where it was and then now where it is, and we'll think about where it will go. And so the project itself was this work that I'd done about documenting what I call emotional capital practices. And that's an idea that essentially is about seeing very young children and their evocative communication as having power. One of my students calls it the bank, where with all their sophisticated developmental capacity, knowing about intention, knowing about cause and effect, when I do this, something else happens, and it comes together in their purposeful, agentic capacity, which I think is very expert, that I've called emotional capital, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it was a scholarship that I had received, and the purpose of the scholarship was to advance knowledge in early childhood education. And for me, with my focus on infants and toddlers, I could see that coming out of my PhD, where we tend to underestimate babies' social and emotional capacities, there was a really big chance to make a difference in terms of practice on the floor for the people that were there this afternoon in a real way with very young children. And the project itself was designed, had an overarching kind of intention to result in reciprocal relationships. So that it was designed as reciprocal research between myself, the research site, children and educators. So it was always about not just coming in and taking with my researcher power, but finding ways to include and give back in a real way. project was designed with certain outcomes in mind to generate new knowledge about the ways infants and toddlers use this emotionally evocative communication by documenting them in early childhood education contexts, because that had not been done. Thinking about emotional capital with babies had not been done. It's been used to talk about women's work and the emotional resources that we use. It's been used in early childhood education to talk about the resources and skills that educators use. But as I saw it, the babies had their own kind of bank of understanding and knowing. The way it was designed as well was to engage in this deep and critical reflection with educators as a form of professional development, and then also to create practical resources that can help children, educators and pre-service teachers better understand infants' emotional behaviours and communication. And so one of the things that I kind of speak to is that if that's my outcome, if I want to end up, that was the intention, to end up in this reciprocal relationship, research relationship that was grounded in respect, that was grounded in an understanding that, I come in as a researcher with a degree of power, potentially, and it was important to me to find ways to share that. And so I came up with this idea when I was doing my PhD about ethical symmetry in participatory research with babies. It had been used with children before, but again, never with such young children. And so it's talked about as this methodological attitude. And what it does is it frames what your choices become. Because if you believe that there should be ethically symmetrical relationships, then that's the starting point for choosing how you enact the research practices. And that reciprocity can be realised through respect and including both the educators and the babies as participants in the research. So it can be experienced and received both by the participants and the research setting in ways that are authentic and that kind of share that power. And, it ended up being the way it ended up looking is that often they took the camera and they ended up, I'd been, as a researcher, I'm there with all my fancy cameras, but they started taking photos of me. They included me in their Facebook site. We love when our friend Andi comes to visit because, anytime you sit down with a laptop in a room, anytime you walk into a room of babies, they're very likely to be interested. And so by then, I would have this little crew of people, and that's me taking a photo of them, and that's the educator taking a photo of me, taking a photo of them. So it becomes this mix where you share the space, and you do it because there is a potential to other infants, to think about them differently as research participants, where really they're deserving of the same respect. What we know about infants is, there are certain ways that they can't be the same. We can't get to know what they think because they can't tell us. But there are many ways that they are the same. And so this idea about ethical symmetry is about focusing on the commonalities of infants as participants to some degree. They can do some parts of what is classically considered a research participant, while considering their inherent and unique differences. So we have to understand the ways that infants do participate and then support this more holistic view of infants' rights. I won't tell that story, that's there for a reason. Ask me later if you want. I'm aware of time. I don't want to run out because there's all the rest of it to come to. And so, as I said, the first intention, and so this slide and the one before is from 2019. And at the time I had theorised, I had come up with the idea of emotional capital, but I'd never documented it, which was a part of why that was the first aim. And as so many researchers do, I used my child with ethical approval. The only concern was no photos of his naked bottom, and then I was allowed to use photos of him. And so, as you see, this idea of emotional capital is about this purposeful expression of negative and positive affect. They have this capacity, I think, as being really sophisticated, because one of the ways I came to this idea of emotional capital is knowing that when we're born, we can't walk, we can't talk, we don't necessarily understand the social world, the cognitive world, but the first thing we can do is really well, one of the first things is cry. So, I think that's got such a great degree of power, because then, in theory, hopefully, the people that we're with are wired to respond. So if knowing what we do about babies and how they learn, it makes complete sense to me that that is the stuff that they learn really well, really quickly. And I could absolutely see it in my child. And so that's him. He used to pretend. And so it's grounded in developmental knowledge about babies. We know that they imitate from birth. There's amazing research about sticking tongues out. We know that once they imitate, they learn about cause and effect. If I do this, someone else might laugh. Or if I do this, someone else, how many times do they happily drop a thing off the high chair and either think you'll come back or whatever the response may be. They come to learn very quickly because they've got these really sophisticated developmental capacities. And so that's him doing one of the things, and a lot of these things I used to do in my practice with babies on the floor. And so you do these and they copy you. They're silly, right? They're funny and fun, I think. And that was him pretending to cry, that one there. He'd go, boo. And I'd say, no, you can't have whatever. Boo. No, you can't have whatever. And that story, again, I don't want to run out of time, but ask me again how that goes, because that kept going until he was 9. But he had words by then. And he would do that. And eventually, if I said no, he'd just turn it off, crawl away, because he knows it's not an effect. They're too smart. But he would do that to my mum. And then she'd go, what do you want? What do you need? So that's what that was the intention, was to document these really sophisticated things that the babies were doing. And I ended up doing that. And this is just a really kind of big list. I'm happy to share it. But these are some of the practices. I haven't even gone into practices, but practices being the things babies, combinations of what they say, what they do, and how they relate. So bundled together. And these are the things that the babies were doing. They blinked, they screamed and looked. Gaze was a really powerful kind of behaviour. That was often what happened was that they were kind of combined together. They flap their arms while crying, they smile, and we'll come to photos where you can see that happening. And one of the things that I was always really interested in was the face, because they're doing really particular things with their brow. They're doing really particular things with their eyes, either turned up or down. And there's a lot of work by Paul Ekman, who looks at the facial expressions of infants and has done research. Again, there's a lot of developmental research there. And I discovered this thing called a Duchenne smile. It's called an enjoyment smile, right? Or an authentic smile. And so when we have an authentic smile, our eyes lift up in the corners. And this is from, lots of analysis of faces and who responds and how. So what I found was that there were times when they would just emote towards someone, and often it was that, and they would over-exaggerate that. My son used to do it. People would get into his stroller, hello, little guy, because he was very cute, right? And people come to cute babies with no consent, except for me holding the stroller, just going, you know. But they, hello, hello, and he would just stare at them, deadpan stare. Then they would walk away and he would go, when they were gone. Like, how many times does a baby wave after you've left? So what I came to see was that there was either these things that they were doing toward people. So there's a distinction between this social expression of emotion and a natural expression. So there was, and that came out of this developmental research. So this baby, for example, was just looking at themselves in the reflection of a door and going, right? And in bursts. They did these bursts of emotion, this rhythmic kind of thing that they would do. So that was the first aim, was to document. The second aim was to engage in this deep and critical reflective practice. And we did it by using, this is the theory I used, and I turned it into a resource that I could use with the educators. So they could think about themselves and include them, because also they knew the babies best. So that was me respecting and understanding that they, you know, if I want to do this well enough, who am I to come in and imagine I know what is happening for this child? The best people to work with are the people that know them best. So that was the participatory nature at the level of the educators. And then the way I did it was to share data with the educators, so there were written observations, photos and videos. And then I used that map to code, to kind of say, are they sayings? Are they doings? What do you think? So that's what it looked like. I would hold the laptop and the babies were always there. So that was another kind of interesting part of it. And one of the methods that I developed, so you can see that the babies were there, but we would sit and have these conversations. I used the map, and as I say here, and this is where we end up in a lot of ways, is that I had things for the babies to do at the time and include them in the research about them. But we looked at the arrangements of practices, and we kind of talked in individual and small groups. So that was that professional development. And then the last intention was to share and disseminate the findings of the research. And I'm just going to go here because, again, I don't want to run out of time. But to achieve the outcomes, it was about kind of sharing this information, using the data to create practical resources that can help children, educators, pre-service teachers. So I created, with the educators, at the end, we collated some of the best photos of every child, and we decided what practice it might be, or what emotion they were feeling, perhaps. And we called that the baby dictionary-ish. And I added the ish because you can never really know that this child is, you know, it's a pretty good guess. But for me, interpreting young children's behaviour, I'm always tentative because I can never say for sure that I know what they're feeling. So it's the baby dictionary-ish. And I did leave that with the educators. I also had an intention to share the research with the centre community. The local community of the town was the plan, but COVID kind of put those big lines there. I was very lucky to still be able to go to the centre, and then the wider communities of early childhood education, pedagogy and practice. And so this is one of those, which is still pretty cool. And I did it, I went travelling. I went on the road, okay, and this is just a selection. And what was really cool was I was kind of using this in a few different ways, both for research presentations, but also, as you see there, with that Early Childhood Australia kind of professional space. Again, so that it would actually get back to the people that made a difference. And here we are. That was, that was that seminar. One of the really cool things is I took it to New York. These babies went to New York, which I tried to tell them, but I don't think they understand how big that is. I told their parents, which was cool. And then, really importantly, I've used it in my teaching. Because what I could see, and in Australia, in our old early years learning framework, we had a practice about intentional teaching. And a lot of people got that wrong. It doesn't mean that you say A, B, C, D. It's about being deliberate, thoughtful and purposeful in your practice, both in the interactions, but also in our spaces, and essentially being kind of creating environments that have sound, developmental, practice-based and personal kind of rationale. There's good reasons. So similarly, and the way I did it was to frame my research using the same ideas as intentional research. So one of the things about if the outcomes were a reciprocal research partnership to develop understandings about infants. So one of the ways that I frame it was that in research we have these aims. In teaching, you've got a learning outcome, you've got an intention for the learning experience you're planning. So it was different language. And if the aims of the research, as I said, were those that we just saw to create resources, as a researcher, I have to ask, what methods will I use to achieve those outcomes? But as a teacher, you've got these outcomes for planned learning experiences, and you could swap out the methods for teaching strategies. To achieve the outcomes of the learning experience, you've got to do certain things. So in research, it's to have methods, but in teaching, it's using strategies. And so what you see here are the pictures of some of those planned methods. I had babies in the meetings, and as I say, I did this thing in my PhD. That was the ethical symmetry kind of article, is that I shared the pictures of themselves with them. They didn't know that I was doing that. They didn't know my plan, but for me it felt the right thing to do, to share it in some way and then see what they did. So I repeated that method, and you can see, you know, they slide on the... I thought the original plan was similar to pedagogical documentation, and this was in my PhD, but I learned that that was just me as a researcher being romantic, probably, because, you know, they come along and they look at it and they're like, yeah, and then they just kept going, right? So that was the intention. I thought I could read what they might think about the, you know, and then do something, but they ate it, they slid on it. And so I kind of, in this project, the second time I did it, I just thought, well, at least I'm just sharing pictures of themselves. Even though they don't know that. That was my kind of nod to saying, well, you've got some of the research. And the other, as you saw, the map, which was the focus of the meeting. So there's the meeting, there's the map. I said the first time I used it, it was eaten, so we learned that we put it up on the wall now so that it doesn't get eaten. The thing about babies, you see, that's where some of those unplanned experiences started to emerge, because you can have a great plan, and the thing about intentional teaching is you have planned and spontaneous learning experience. So what happens when the plan doesn't go according to plan? You have to see what the babies are actually doing. And what they were really interested in was me and my things. You know, you've got a room full of babies, you turn around and there's someone in my camera bag, and there's someone wanting that and drawing on my laptop and wanting my notebook. And so, you know, they were initiating these interactions with me. And one of the things that I'd said earlier is that in research you have to have ethics that say, well, I'm a researcher, but if the baby interacts with me, I will respond, because it's unethical not to. To imagine that I can sit there and they don't notice me is not true and fair. So these were some of the methods, and it was through their active engagement with me and my things that they started to shift the course of the plan. And that actually ended up in these results and outcomes of the project, that weren't planned. And so that's some of the things. They were interested in more than the pictures. Because of who I am, because of my story, I brought in, I felt a bit like Diane Fossey, an anthropologist in the jungle with gorillas. I'm a native in early childhood settings. So, there's that part of me that had to acknowledge that, or didn't have to, but I spent a lot of time realising they were interested in more. And so thinking about intentional teaching as purposeful decisions and actions, I brought in these old business cards and some of the tissue boxes I found at the centre. And so I chose those based on this developmental expectation that children of this age are usually, and so remember, developmental milestones are a guide, but in my experience, they're often really interested in posting, so putting one thing into another. So I've got 1 billion business cards that I had never used, and a good early childhood teacher, that turns into a learning resource. And all the time I was critical, and so that's using professional judgment. I also had conversations with the educators, so slowly it was shifting the course of the research. But then what ended up happening over the course of time is that we ended up in this place, again, because of who I am and bringing those resources in. And it was really clear that I had this really kind of big amount of care in my decision making, of including them, but in a real and authentic way that still fit what I was there to do. I had to remember, well, what am I here for? What's my purpose? And it wasn't to be a teacher, but in the spirit of reciprocity, I thought, well, I am here. They have me for a little bit of time. And also it was, part of that professional judgment. And really in conversations over the course of a month that I wrestled with this line, and the educators were really inviting me in as well. So this participatory nature of the project kind of took a different turn, and I ended up it ended up in these unintended outcomes, and I did this kind of shared group time where I brought in some books, and no way, no how did I imagine, and this was like my 5th visit, so 5 weeks. I didn't take it lightly, but here it is.
And there. Here a wolf, there a wolf, everywhere a wolf, wolf. Oh my God, had a fun. E-I-E-I-O.
And the sound you can hear is the other room.
Oh my God, had a fun. E-I-E-I-O. And on that farm he had a sheep. What does the sheep say? Ba. E-I-E-I-O. With a baba here and a baba there. Here a bar, there a bar, everywhere a bar. Oh, MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O. What else? Can you see the dog? You see that? And there's the sheep. Ba, ba. Now what's here? It's a duck. It's a duck. Oh, MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O. And on that farm he had a duck.
And these two educators have never worked with a toddler room.
Here a quack, there a quack, everywhere a quack, quack. Oh my God, had a farm. See that one? There's the duck. Quack, quack. There's the dog. Everyone's loving this dog sick. They're all just sick. This is so cute from this angle. And there's a sheep.
Yeah, I know. Yes, it is. And that's what that room was like. And that's a part of what I was hoping to, or it was a part of my rationale, for at least while I was there. But I didn't plan it, and I did a lot of critical thinking about whether or not it was okay to do that. And again, it was about doing it with them in ways and hopefully giving something, certainly to those children, because that's what it could be like. So I thought even if they have some nice little times. The thing about group time, I always have to write disclaimer. You know, I call it shared group time because it's tricky with babies. You know, I've tended to do this kind of shared time because I think, you know, it's really useful to help very young children learn to be around each other if we're helping them be together. But, you know, it's within a democratic a space as we can make it. So we can bring the babies there, or even children. I've never forced children to stay at a group time. So if a baby crawled away, that was their choice, but they couldn't come there. Some of them can't move. And the other thing about ethics is this idea of assent, where you read the child's cues to decide if they're feeling okay about being there or not. And so that baby, for example, had been crying and I didn't start, or I kind of stopped, and someone came and sat with them. And not because of me, but it's one of the things she tended to do. So that was the original project. This is in 2020. My last visit was in December. And then if you fast forward, I had a feeling that I wanted to finish fulfill the other outcomes and actually share the research. One of the things I tend to do is go back to the site and say, well, here's where it's travelled. You know, again, not just taking it away, but saying, oh, thank you, and have a look at where we've ended up. And so I had this kind of plan, first to come back and do that and have that conversation. But then I remember I had a conversation with the director, and a lot of those same children were there. I left my actual artefacts back at the ranch. So, sorry. And this was my plan, right? I had an intro where I was going to show them the things that I brought them, that I used in the research about them. So in ways, it was like the last member checking visit. As a researcher, you go back and you say to the participants, well, this is what I've done with it. What do you think? So I had this intro. I was going to show them my bag, what's in it, tell them who I am, invite them. I wanted to do an acknowledgement of country with them, because that's what I have done, right? And so what I did in a developmentally appropriate way is tell them the story that I said, I'm here to tell a story. And so that was kind of the plan. Invite them to respond to the pictures, show them the dictionary, and show them the PowerPoint slides. I printed them all. I printed the dictionary. So there were photos of themselves that I brought back to them. And then I was going to read How Do I Feel? Because one of the outcomes of the project, I believe, is that if babies are doing this sophisticated emotional work at 6 months old, we've got a really useful chance to start where the babies are and think about, well, how can that be a learning experience? And as I see it, and in my practice, what that might be is about naming emotions. So developing this emotional literacy early. It's called mind-mindedness. In research, where you actually use the psychological, it seems like Andi's sad, and then it helps them read other people, but also understand and name their own feelings. So that was kind of the plan. And what was just really wild, first of all, seeing their faces, and you know, I was like, and you're Maria, and you're Andi. And the educators were like, they'd never met me before, but I knew these children. And they were all there. So it was just really quite amazing. And so what ended up happening is I sat down with these things, the photos of them, the printed PowerPoint slides, and it ended up being that I was telling them the story about what I did. And so I don't have yet the videos that I'm allowed to share, but I took a little sound bite, and you'll see where we ended up. He's making a big, big smile with his eyes. And I think that's what you were doing. That's your mouth. He's making a big, big smile with his eyes. And I think that's what you were doing. That's your mouth. Your baby does that. What is that? So I just had these, back on the floor with children. Forgot how much they talk.
You had a baby, didn't you? You had a baby brother, I think. What is it?
Oh, it's the same thing over and over.
You have a baby. You want to take a photo?
I want to take a photo of you, they said.
Alright. Here. Me too.
They all want to take photos of me. So that's just one of them. Oh, and then in the screen, I was making silly faces. So they're just laughing.
Let's do it this way. Look. Oh, you want to take a photo?
So they gave them my camera, my phone, and they took a few photos of me. And the centre was okay. I kind of checked that it was okay to do these things, but because it's part of the project and I still haven't figured out, is an extension of the existing ethics or is it a new project? So I haven't quite shared the rest of it. And what it ended up being was that I did do this group time with them the next. So that was a bit of a hello. I arrived in the afternoon. What was interesting is that that's how it was set up. I've never done a group time like that. Also because it wasn't completely planned. I had the plan there, but I had my laptop. And so if you can imagine, however many children, again, like it's not normally how I would have done it, but I was working with these educators and I had to respect that that's what they presented for me, so I tried to work with that. And so as you saw, I printed up these presentations and so I've transcribed part of the voiceover. What was happening was they couldn't see. We tried to set it up on the big screen. So, as people who work with children know, if you don't have it right, it gets a bit messy. And, they kept coming up closer and I've never said sit on your bottom as many times because it meant that they're sitting on top of each other and this one starts crying and it actually is quite full on. I forgot how sophisticated it could be to make it feel like it's easy. Because otherwise it's quite difficult. And so I said, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about how when some of the children in this room were babies, I came to visit them. And when I came to visit, who knows what I did? And then they screamed, you came here. And I said, yes, I came here. And I took pictures of some of the children. So I came here and who knows what? What is that? And so I pulled out the camera that I used to take the photos of them. A camera, someone screams. And then on the laptop, I presented the presentation of them that I had used so often. And all they wanted, where's me? Where's me? Who's that? They wanted to know. And again, the laptop wasn't good because they couldn't see, so that caused problems. And then I said to them, so that's part of my story. Before we keep going, do you know what land we are on? Andi, do you know what land we are on? And then someone goes, we're in Dubbo. And I said, yes, we're on Wiradjuri land. And I invited them to say it. And I said, so that's my story. And I said, that's because we need to tell the story of the people whose land we are. So literally what I've done with you, I was able to do with them. And then I invited them to say Wiradjuri, and they did. And I also told them about paying my respects. That's part of my story and a part of the story of the land we're on. We went on to look at the dictionary, the photos, and we broke down the parts of the faces the children were making. So they started guessing what the feeling was. Oh, I guess that fits. They were guessing what the feeling was, and I actually ended up using the resource with the children, doing that mind-mindedness with their photo, with the resource, which was pretty wild. And one of the really cool parts was, you know, to me, that's that deconstructing and naming that many of those children were displaying, and it's developing that emotional literacy that helps them, you know, it's called the hidden curriculum. So often, certainly in primary in Australia, but what I love about early childhood is that those are the actual explicit outcomes, is the hidden curriculum in a lot of ways. They're called the soft skills that corporate worlds talk about, right? Start with the babies. And really that's a part of building that. And so the outro, if you go back to the plan, the plan was to read this book and invite anyone to draw how they felt. I kind of didn't, again, plan on a giant table where everyone had to sit. But again, that's how it happened. So I worked with that. Again, that was quite busy. I want this colour. I want that colour. And then what we ended up doing was just really turning this into a learning experience and a drawing experience. We talked about the shape of the faces. I've got a round face. It starts with a circle. And then I was saying, I see it. There's the eyes and nose and mouth. And then I say, what kind of a face is it? And they said, it's an angry face. I said, oh, it's angry. And then someone screams, I'm making a silly face. And I said, okay, you're making a silly face. I like silly faces. And I said, oh, that's awesome. You know, that's a scary one. It's great. I see his eyes, his arms and his legs. And so there was lots of noise. And then that was the funny face. I'm making a funny face, laughing. So really, you know, engaging with them in this way that certainly I didn't intend. And so I took this photo in my office because I found this ginormous notice board, and I love notice boards, but I couldn't take it home because it was too big to fit anywhere. So I just put everything I had that is the project on it. And, you know, in a way it kind of documents all the parts of what this project is. So those are the tools I used. I had a good camera I called, the little camera, and then an old phone for different kinds of data. That was a ball that I used. Those were some of the examples of the photos of the children that I shared with them. That's a smashed up tissue box. You know, so I think what's been really cool is seeing this progression. That's the dictionary, and what I realised is this, how do I feel this book, and then those are the pictures on the side that they drew. But that book is too old for them. And so for me, what's next is thinking about going back. There are two parts of what's next. Before I went back, the what's next was going to be doing the project and purposely playing in this particular way with the babies and seeing how they respond. Because it happened by accident in this project, but I kind of see it in a way as not an intervention, but, you know, what happens when you do present a thoughtful, planned experience and then invite the educators to do the same. So that was the next project I thought to do, but what I will do is go back and because I'm the early childhood teacher I am, which makes me the researcher I am, I would love to do that again with the children, but do it better. So that it actually, and I keep thinking, you know, is this about me? I will stop going back. But a part of why I will go back is to actually do the thing and present the research to the community as I'd planned. So that's what that trip was about, to start that conversation. And they're really keen to have me back and to share it. And again, I think for me, what's been so great is, you know, starting with this, you know, commitment to including the children. I feel like I really love the idea of ending up back with the children.